Last week, we talked about the decision of an Australian court in Sydney to shield two so-called nurses who threatened on video to murder any patients who came into the hospital seeking medical aid who also happened to be Israeli, while bragging that they had already made good on this threat with many Jewish patients. And this week, we saw exactly where that kind of signaling approval for this kind of behavior leads. An elderly Jewish man in Melbourne's Alfred Hospital spent the final hours of his life staring at a hospital wall that had maliciously been plastered with a Star of David that had a red line slashed through it. This poor man died staring at that threat in a hospital. When you signal tolerance of truly radical bigotry, like making open death threats against an entire race of people, then you cannot pretend to be surprised or horrified that this kind of signaling emboldened the kind of maliciousness that would target a dying man and plaster his wall with hatred so that it was the last thing that he ever saw or experienced in this world. A human being, an actual human being, died looking at that tolerated extremism, because those in authority, those with power, continue to signal that the perpetrators will be shielded from any consequences, and even from anything but the mildest form of judgment. This horrifying story was buried in a detailed expose about the rampant anti-Semitism that has been allowed to fester inside of hospitals full of vulnerable and dying people in Australia. Ever since October 7th, when Hamas massacred thousands of civilians after systematically gang raping many of them and mutilating their genitalia, as well as employing other sick forms of torture, including on children, well-documented systematic hatred of Jews has spread throughout Australia, especially in their healthcare system. Doctors and nurses have shown up to work wearing unacceptably unprofessional, genocidal slogans, such as "from the river to the sea," instead of checking their personal political beliefs at the door and behaving like actual adults, meaning professionally. But they prefer to behave like ideological rapists by forcing their worldview into other unwilling people's heads in the workplace and other professional spaces, no matter how unwilling they are to have that done to them. Bathroom stalls and entire hospital corridors alike have been heavily papered with anti-Israel stickers that all are forcibly subjected to, and this is allowed. A Jewish ICU nurse finally quit after more than a decade on the job because management refused to act and so much as check any of this. And here are the results when you make that decision. Results that any moral society should be deeply ashamed of. That you would target a dying person with your political beliefs, that shows a level of dehumanizing depravity that is hard to even comprehend. To display an easy ability to dehumanize another human being to that degree that you would ideologically violate them in that way, in the most vulnerable moment of their life as they are dying, is evil beyond words. And hospitals are not the only place where entirely unprofessional ideological rape in the form of inserting your private political opinions into your professional responsibilities is being tolerated. One mother in Melbourne called a suicide hotline after learning that 2 of her own cousins had been murdered in a kibbutz by Hamas. The suicide prevention counselor actually scolded her for not prioritizing sympathy for Gazans over the feelings that she had about her dead cousins, instead of treating her in the compassionate way that you should treat anyone who calls a suicide hotline in crisis. And the bowing down to these ideological rapists just continued. A conference educating people on life-saving treatments for gunshot wounds was entirely canceled after anti-Israel medical workers threatened to protest the conference because those life-saving techniques had been developed on actual battlefields by Israelis. And so, because their politics are that fragile and their hatred is that strong, they not only want to allow more people in their care to die of gunshot wounds rather than receive education from someone that they disagreed with politically, but they also want to stop other people who wanted to receive that education from being able to get it. And they were allowed to succeed in that fascist goal. They prevented the normal, sane, healthy healthcare workers from even having the option of attending the conference and learning these life-saving techniques. Only weeks later, a father and a son, Muslim extremist terrorist duo, shot a bunch of people on the first night of Hanukkah on Bondi Beach. A situation where training for the best on-site emergency treatment of gunshot wounds would have been incredibly useful had not the politically captured bigots been allowed to control society, thanks to the unbelievable cowards in positions of power, kowtowing to them instead of reprimanding them and warning them to up their professionalism, which is the appropriate response to this sort of fascism. And this cowardly signaling of approval for the repulsive has only predictably emboldened the very people that you should not be emboldening. Activists, influencers, and pro-Palestine medical groups. Once again, the insertion of the political being tolerated in the professional, such as the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, only predictably ramped up their political pressuring of Australia's Healthcare Regulation Agency, AHPRA, in very real ways, being allowed to set important policies when they have demonstrated how biased, how unprofessional, and how out of whack their priorities are. Which is why you have hospitals where they are being allowed to torture dying patients who came from ethnicities that they don't like. Unsurprisingly, one of the main priorities of these activist campaigners in the medical field is to revoke the healthcare agency's adoption of the internationally recognized definition of anti-Semitism, so that they can have even broader free rein in their vile campaign against vulnerable people in hospitals, with even less chance of facing consequences for it, even though those chances are already practically non-existent in Australia. This poor, dying man at the Alfred Hospital had no one who was willing to protect him from these monsters. He was abandoned to whatever form of torment made them feel good. And he died being forced to look at a threat that was openly being made against any person who belonged to his entire race. Again, it was a Star of David. That's a threat against Jews, not the country of Israel. And the saddest part is that no one is surprised by any part of this story. There are those who care deeply, people who still have a moral conscience that has not been entirely eviscerated by social media and politics, who are open-minded enough to have heard enough of these stories to know that they are not rare. And then you have the people who also know that they are not rare and who also don't care. And ironically, it's primarily the people in the second group who believe that they would have risked their life to be a hero and hide Anne Frank from the Nazis in World War II. They won't even make the tiniest waves to stand up to this. But sure, they would do that. The reality is that there will always be those who delude themselves with comforting lies. The question is, are the rest of us going to be one of them? Or are we going to stand up together and say, enough is enough, and push this vile and rotting behavior back out of the public square and into the slummy shadows where it belongs? We will each have to answer that question for ourselves. And one day, we will each be held accountable for our choice.